Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Savannah Bretthauer, and on behalf of Dr. Sasha Thomason, the Animal Facilities Inspection Program Director for the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and all of our staff, we want to welcome you to today's webinar. I serve as the AFI Inspection Investigator, and I appreciate you taking the time today for this webinar focused on fostering programs and using data. For the next 60 minutes, we'll be focused on fostering programs using data. The webinar will explore using data to figure out who to recruit, how to retain, and which populations should be fostered. This is important to our KDA licensees for a couple of reasons. We currently have 291 shelter and rescue network licenses across the state of Kansas. Due to the current events, not only in our state, but around the US, shelters and rescue networks are relying pretty heavily on foster homes to keep animals healthy, shelters empty to receive emergencies, and help build community engagement. Creating a strong and healthy foster network reduces stress on our licensees. It allows ample time and space for you guys to maintain your facilities. And it creates the opportunity to assist in an emergency situation like seizures or a natural disaster. Just a few housekeeping items before the session begins. During the presentation portion of this session, all participants' microphones will be muted by the meeting host. If you have any questions during the presentations, please submit them. Please submit your questions using the chat button at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring the chat room the entire time so I can have your guys' questions set aside. Lastly, this session is going to be recorded and will be posted online next week. So I'd like to introduce to you guys Tim Yeglin. He is with the Best Friends Animal Society. He did do our class last month if you guys were here. If not, I'll give you a little bit of a bio on him. 35 years ago, a group of people made a leap of faith to realize a vision that had long been shared, to create a sanctuary for abandoned and abused animals. This was the logical extension of the rescue and advocacy work they had been doing for years at that point. Little did they appreciate that their endeavor would catapult them into the forefront of a fledgling movement to end the killing of 17 million dogs and cats who were dying in our nation's shelters annually at the time. With little money, no master plan, few construction skills, and countless lives hanging in the balance, they set out to address a local aspect of a much larger problem. What they created instead was the largest no-kill animal sanctuary in the world and a national movement to end the killing of companion animals. Born in Illinois, Tim found himself living in Indiana and Iowa before permanently settling down here in Kansas. Tim's decade-long journey into animal welfare began by volunteering his master photography skills to take pictures of the adorable cats and dogs at various Kansas City area animal shelters. His love for shelters and their work led him to take a marketing position at a local shelter. He became the director of operations at that fledgling shelter and helped restructure it one department at a time. Tim is particularly good at teaching shelter dogs household manners for their adopted homes. He's passionate about reducing the fear, anxiety, and stress of all animals and loves to strengthen the human-animal bond. Tim, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you now to share your presentation.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to be here, everybody. One of the other things that I'm super excited about is data. So everything that we do at Best Friends is data driven. And I stare at data all day long, mainly analyzing data, going over data, working with shelters with their data. And so I created this program to kind of go over how we can start utilizing data from our respective softwares and things like that. So I'm going to try to breeze through this pretty quickly. I will send the slide deck out to Savannah so that if you're interested, you can get it from them, mainly because every time I've given this, I've gone a little bit long. So I'm going to try to burn through this relatively quickly so we can get to the questions at the end. So we basically, when we talk about data, we need to kind of talk about like where it's coming from, right? So we get our data from sheltering software, whether that's PetPoint, Shelter Love, Chameleon, Shelter Buddy, Pawlytics, which is a really popular foster-based rescue software. Any of those softwares, if you're not using the software, I highly recommend it. A lot of them are very affordable. Like I know Pawlytics and Shelter Love is like $1 an adoption kind of a thing to pay for the software. But what you're really looking for is the reporting that happens on the backside of that, because that's ultimately what we're going to be talking about today and what we're going to be analyzing. I have a history with a software that the reporting was absolutely garbage. And it was horrible and it made my life a lot more difficult than one of these ones that I mentioned. Once we switched it over to the shelter that I used to work at, we used Shelter Love, which was fantastic. The reporting was great, and I was able to get all the information that I needed out of it. But there's definitely studies and data out there that data-driven organizations have higher performance than those that do not use, that use some sort of alternative method of making decisions. So they're usually 5 to 6% more effective in that. So if you think 5 to 6% more adoptions, 5 to 6% reduction in length of stay, 5 to 6% more efficiency across the board when we're actually looking into our data. So the data gives us the ability to clearly see where we need to focus our efforts. It gives us the starting point where we can have the greatest impact. Being strategic in targeting the right groups means that we will maximize our resources, which the last time I checked, we all have limited resources. So if we use accurate data, then tracking year over year and month over month progress becomes very, very easy. And then we can make adjustments along the way. So if the data is showing us the results that aren't where we want them to be, that allows us to pivot and then make adjustments to the program. And then we can start tracking the success of those programs. So most importantly, we have hard data that shows the success. Like that one right there is the big one, because then we can actually show hard data to our supporters, whether that be like our donors, our taxpayers, to the board, to our municipal agencies that are, funding our organizations, and it basically helps make the community part of the solution and the problem solving that we're trying to do. So these are typical kind of target population groups. Like there's nothing new here. Animals that need a break, seniors, puppies, kittens, nursing animals, that kind of a thing. And so what we're really looking at is like, what are we talking about for data collection? So the more data you have, the more data can be plotted to find out where the trends are. So was last year an anomaly, or is that the norm? I primarily think of like the COVID, right? So in this post-COVID era, it's critical to find out what those trends are doing and what the trends are moving. At Best Friends, we are tracking national data, and then I can drill in and look at regional trends as well to find out, oh yeah, length of stay is going up and adoptions are in fact going down. And then we can track that month over month and year over year to see like what is the new normal going to be. I do have a story about like the being honest with the data is critical. So I was talking with a veterinarian who was assisting a shelter with surgeries. There was a dog that came in, he noticed some spots on it, and he was just like, hey, I think this dog has mange. The shelter at that point was like, oh, this isn't a surgery candidate. And then they took him back and euthanized him. And I don't tell that story to be like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. But what they wound up doing was when they entered that euthanasia into the software, they put it as unhealthy and treatable, which mange is a treatable illness. But because they didn't put it into the software correctly, and what that veterinarian found was they were not putting any of the stuff in there correctly. So if we did start a program and we wanted to see progress, it's not going to show any progress because the data has been entered incorrectly. So be honest with your data. Be honest with what is happening within your organization so that when we do have an idea of like where do we want to put our resources, we can actually build out programs and track the results. So what we're actually looking at so we get that data out, we're going to start analyzing it. What are we looking for? So what percentage of like neonatal kittens, like 6 to 8 weeks old, mothers with litters, ringworm animals, like how many of those are we getting out of those groups? Like which are the ones that are most at risk? So say like, was the shelter built in the 1970s and does not have any isolation? So upper respiratory infections and ringworm spread like mad. Is it that there is a massive influx of neonatal kittens, orphan kittens coming in? Is it a lot of senior dogs? Like your data is going to tell you all of that stuff, and that will help kind of guide you into where you really need to focus your attention. Is which ones are most at risk of one, getting sick, but two, also at risk of euthanasia or failing to thrive or things like that. So we're also looking at from that group, which are the ones that are the quickest to get adopted? Well, typically like kittens and puppies, right? So if we're looking at, okay, well, we're getting a lot of neonates and they have a very high failure to thrive rate, but on the back end, if we're able to get them healthy and get them on the adoption floor, they tend to get adopted right away, right? So maybe that's where we start because it's kind of more or less kind of like low hanging fruit. If we fix this one thing, we can get a lot more animals adopted. This gives you a kind of a starting point in the goal. So when we're looking at the goals and you're looking at your resources and you're like, I don't know, like the goal is obviously to save all of the neonatal kittens. It may not be feasible in the first year to do so. So look at your resources and then find out like what is an appropriate goal. Is it 30%, 50%, 20%? So you can increase that goal year over year as the program matures and you build up that solid foster base. And then that's where the tracking comes in of pulling regular data and tracking those trend lines and seeing where that process is. And then you can start building that out. And then by the end of like say a 3-year time frame, if that's part of like a strategic plan, at the end of 3 years, we want to build out a foster program and we want to save 100% of our neonatal kittens. Well, obviously that goes like 33%, 66%, and then we'll have 100% year over year, and then have a plan on how we're going to achieve that goal. These are some of the examples, right? Of all of these are candidates for foster. So we know the adoption rates are typically higher for healthy kittens and puppies. And so the idea would be like if we can lower the failure to thrive rate on that, then ultimately that results in higher adoption rates for that group, right? So that's what we're actually looking at, is kind of a where to kind of start or where to grow those kind of programs. So as we're looking at the needs, you have to evaluate what your limitations are. What resources do you have? Is this something that we can fundraise? Can you do a kitten shower event before the busy season, which would be like essentially now, before we ahead of like kitten season? So you need to ask yourself, like, what would it take for us to be able to serve this group of animals? And then we need to build out that plan on like, how do we achieve that? So when we're looking at like program goals, using the data will help kind of answer this, right? So your data will have the answers to pretty much all of these questions, but it's up to you to determine the goals of the program. So we're going to start off small and grow over time and track the success and celebrate the successes. And so if our goal is to save 10% of the neonate kittens that came in and we did do that, we need to celebrate it. And maybe if it was too easy, maybe we need to, that's one where we can tweak it and be like, next month we're going to do 25%. And we can adjust that goal throughout that time frame. So the idea would be, we start off small, grow it over time, and then see the adoption rate increase. One of the things that, when you have a robust foster program, what I see works in shelters is, when they call and be like, hey, I have a litter of kittens, be like, hey, okay, can you come at say 4 p.m.? They get with their foster coordinator. A foster is standing in intake. The kittens come in, they get weighed, they do the exams, they do all of the stuff that needs to be done given the age and whatever is appropriate for the protocol for those kittens. And then they immediately get handed to the foster. So they are not in the shelter for like more than 30 minutes. Now that foster could also be a rescue. I've seen that work incredibly well. That's actually what we do up in Omaha, is there is a rescue that when the neonates come in, they call them, they are standing there when the kittens come in. They'll do the initial exam. They get to hear what the veterinarians are saying about the animals, and then they get passed off and transferred to the rescue, and the rescue is able to care for them. And that works incredibly well. What we ultimately would want to see is like if we are sending 30% of animals into foster, we're hoping that we'll see a 30% increase in our adoption rate. Right. So if we're sending 100% of the nursing cats into foster and we're only seeing a 30% adoption rate, then we know that that's a red flag. And that is something that we need to go back to and be like, there is something wrong in this process. Like what is failing in this process? So having regular tracking of the data and of the goals is critical to see like when things start to go off the rails. Like Are we not doing the appropriate training that we need to do? Is it one foster is primarily the result of 50% of the failure rate? Okay, we need to do more training with that person, or maybe cats is not really for them. Maybe we need to switch them over to dogs or something along those lines. So generally, when we're talking about like resources, we're talking about time and money. So COVID taught us to question every process, mainly out of necessity, but mainly during that time, we learned a lot about our organization and what is actually possible. So typically, when we're talking about fosters, it's helping those get out of the shelter and be cared for in a way that we are incapable of doing at the shelter. That is typically how we do it, right? We have um, animal had surgery, it needs post-surgery care that we can't give for in the shelter. That's a great thing. So I think of primarily like eye inoculations or like amputations or something like that. Those are great things for foster homes, right? So we can go ahead and put them into fosters so they can have the post-op care that they need that we're unable to do in the shelter. But that process pretty much leaves out one pretty big group, and that's usually behavior dogs. Uh, Behaviorally challenged dogs are incredibly difficult to find fosters for, right? So when I talk to shelters about their behavior dogs, and the answer is always the same. It's like, we just don't have enough time to spend with these dogs. And it was just like, okay, well, let's drill into that. I'm like, why don't you have time? So let's look at like where is like let's look at the data, right? Let's look at where is your time spent. It's like it's because they have to care for like 50, 60, or 100 other animals, right? So the idea would be like, well, how much staff resources could we free up if those animals weren't in the shelter? If the healthy animals were in foster, that would give us more time to actually look after the ones that we can't put into foster, right? So that allows us to then look at like, okay, well, if I could offload 50% of my population and get them into the community and into foster homes, they're healthy, they're easily adoptable. So we can adopt them out without any problems out of the foster homes, then that frees up more staff time to work on the animals that maybe have a little bit more challenges that we can do in the shelter. So over time and with additional training, then we can start moving some of those fosters into more of a territory where we could potentially put some behaviorally challenged dogs to get in-home training with the fosters. So then we're talking about like basically training our fosters to be at a level of where the staff are, or what would be typically like an enrichment team or a behavior team in a shelter. So when we're allocating responsibilities, there's three models that we can do. Typically, larger organizations have one or more foster coordinators, right? These are the high resource shelters. The smaller agencies usually have that responsibility is spread out over a group of people. And the one thing is like communicate, if you're going to do like co-managers or kind of a team, communication is critical because that's where things get dropped and things fall through the cracks and all that stuff. So there is a hybrid model, which is there's one point of contact for all fosters to contact, but the duties are delegated out to that team. And that's one that the co-manager thing, I've not seen it work effectively well. I have seen the hybrid model work very well. And then of course, the ones that the higher resource where they have multiple foster coordinators, that's amazing. So here's some like three statements as to why someone should be a foster. So a lot of this stuff that we're talking about here is like people want to be a part of your life-saving mission. I was like, gosh, that sounds like a marketing campaign, right? That totally sounds like marketing. It's because it is. Because recruitment is marketing. In marketing is essentially demographics. We're not talking advertising, but when we're talking marketing, we're talking demographics. And demographics is your data, right? So what we can do then is we can run demographic information from our current fosters, right? Hopefully we're getting driver's license and things like that, so we can figure out age and sex and that type of stuff of who is currently fostering for us, and then break that data down into like which group of animals are they typically fostering. And so that gives us more information, right? The more information we have, the more we can send out trend lines and things like that. So then what we can do is obviously we're looking at for animal lovers, but then obviously like after that, what like we kind of break down our donors in the same way. So hopefully you're using a CRM where you're tracking all of your donor information and you're trying to figure out like where are they coming from, how much are they giving, and doing all of that fun stuff. Basically, at the shelter I worked at, what we found was at least on our Facebook page, our followers were women between the ages of 35 and 55. And that was the demographic that we used primarily to get that was the first hit that we did for our marketing for fosters. And then we tracked like what were they interested in. Whoops. And then so um, then what we did was it was like, okay, well, what if you wanted older or younger fosters, like ones that are going to be younger than 35 or older 55? Well, what we found was the shelter was also in a bit of a retirement area, so there was a lot of retirees, and that is a great, like they're at home all the time. Like it's great. They can totally foster animals and they love to foster animals. It's like, where do they hang out? Well, a lot of them hung out at the library. So we actually set up a table at the library. That's where we did our recruiting. And that's actually where we did our training. We didn't make them come to the shelter to do the training because that was difficult for them. They could get to the library pretty easily. And so then it was just like that, let's meet them where they are and let's find out how we can reach that audience. At the time, TikTok wasn't really a thing. I was before it was, I don't know what it was before it was TikTok, but but that's a good resource to get the younger audience. But we also have to know like so these are all things, ideas in order to reach the audience. And you'll see like social media is on there, but we also need to understand social media and that we can't use the same campaign on Facebook that we use on TikTok. It doesn't work. And then we can't use the same on, I would say Twitter, X, whatever it's called now. Like those things are different. Instagram is different. Like all of those things that we have as our platforms, they're different. So we have to understand like what is the primary demographic of who is using those social media platforms. And then we have to tailor a marketing campaign to get engagement from those individuals in order to foster. So showing how easy it is, having testimonials, things like that, engaging the current fosters that we have, and then hit it with those platforms is going to be critical. And again, if your followers are 35 to 55, then that, and you're wanting to get people that are in their 20s, that is not the platform to go to. So you have to build the following on those platforms or pay for advertising and do it that way. So uh, foster to adopt has been referred to as kind of like test driving the home. So this is a great way for a family to get involved with the organization. So in a lot of times this would be like maybe it's a new volunteer that has volunteered with you and be like, hey, would you mind taking this animal home to do like a sleepover or a night out or something like that? They're already engaged with the organization, and then we can start growing that to outside the organization to being like, well, I don't know that I just fostering seems like it's just a lot. Be like, well, why don't you just try it for the weekend, see how it goes. If it's too much, then you can bring the dog back. It's fine. At least it got out of the shelter for a couple days, or it got out of we can test drive the fosters that way, right? So they're test driving like whether or not this program is a good fit for them, and then we're test driving them to see like are they going to be kind of the good fit for what we're looking for a foster, or is it one that they're just like they're just indecisive on like what to adopt, and then we can run through several foster to adopt kind of situations until they actually make a decision on who they want to adopt out. There was on the Maddie's call a couple weeks ago, they did one on kind of the latest data on sleepovers in field trips and cortisol levels and things like that. So I highly recommend going out to Maddie's and looking that up because that data is absolutely fascinating. They also did a sleep study, so they had fitness trackers on the dogs and did that sort of stuff. And so the field trips are a great way to get the person into like a tiny commitment to be like, hey, why don't you foster for the weekend, see how it goes, and then we can potentially send that out. If it went good, do you mind fostering this dog for like 2 weeks? Right? And let's get them out of the shelter. Let's get them like so we can sleep and do some of that stuff, and like let's get them healthy again. Let's get them mentally stable. They may have to come back to the shelter, and the research shows that the cortisol levels will go back up, but it goes back up to the baseline of where it was in the shelter. It never goes increases. So that was really good to know as well. So ultimately, we're going to create the marketing plan around like the busy seasons. Like who are we targeting? Like what is the group that we're targeting? So if we're going to be talking about like it's neonate kittens, we need to be getting on that now, right? Because kitten season is right around the corner. Like things are warming up. I mean, it's like practically 60 degrees here, right? So things are going to start progressing very, very quickly. So we need to get on that right now. And then we need to like budget appropriately. What is the length of the campaign? Like, what are we going to do? And we need to get ahead of all of that stuff. We need to start gathering supplies now, especially if it's going to be for kitten season. If it's going to be for like senior dogs and things like that, you know, it's one of those things like we can hit up some of those retirement communities, not necessarily retirement home, but retirement communities, and see if they would foster a senior dog. They're going to be a lot lower energy, things like that. They get out. We can hopefully adopt out from those kind of situations where it'd be like, oh yeah, we have the senior dog in the foster home, and then we can make arrangements to, you know, come back to the shelter to be adopted, or whatever process we want. They also probably, if you're doing offsite adoption events like Petco or PetSmart or something like that, they can show up, and it's a good way of getting your animals there, of getting all your fosters there, and we don't actually have to pull animals from out of the shelter to go to these offsite adoption events. So, and then, you know, modify future campaigns to maximize your return on investment. So when we get into like training the fosters, we need to make it as easy as possible. It's always where it is. We can do in-group training. Like there's pros and cons with all that. If you're going to be doing in-person training, there's a couple things to think of. We need to tailor the training to the group. And I don't know if you guys have been through it, but I've been through it where if you want to foster cats, you have to go through 30 minutes of like puppy fosters. They put everybody together. And there's nothing worse than just sitting there for 30 minutes when something doesn't apply to you, right? So we can tailor it to the specific group, and we can have a kitten foster, we can have a puppy foster, and we can have break it down in that. Online trainings are a fantastic way of like, we can do the training, record it, put it up there, watch these videos, and then it takes less staff time, especially if it's a population we don't get a ton of. And so instead of like doing a one-off training where nobody shows up, I've been there. It's not fun. So have training on different days and times. Not everybody can make it on a Saturday. Like I've seen kids soccer matches that go all freaking day on Saturdays. Like they're not going to be able to come. So offer it on a Tuesday night or a Wednesday night at like 7 p.m. So make it convenient for people to be able to come and get the training so that we can serve the animals. And then we also want to make it like as easy as possible. Like how quick can we do it? Like I've seen like it like I put a foster application in, and then 3 months later they got back to me, and then I was able to foster. I was like, 3 months. I was just like, that's like, how can we get them an animal like tomorrow? Like how much training can we do today and then get them an animal out of the shelter and into their home immediately? So one-on-one trainings are good for animals that need kind of like that have special needs, essentially. So this is a good one for, you know, surgery post-op and that type of stuff. One that is not going to be a group training because we just don't get a ton of them, but we can do one-on-one. You can do one-on-one individually with, you know, to keep fosters engaged and that type of stuff, but it's definitely something that's, you know, it's generally tied to animals that have, you know, a specific need. If you don't have a handbook, definitely highly recommend going on our network site. So it's network.bestfriends.org. This particular handbook, if you go over to proven strategies and then click on operations, and then it's under fostering and adoption, there's going to be the handbook there. And you can use that as a template to use that as a starting point, and then you can modify it to fit your organization's needs. There's also the Maddie's Pet Assistant app is really good to get fosters to get them to like easily to get them to answer questions, right? So it'd be like, oh, this kitten has diarrhea. They can get on the app and be like, when is diarrhea severe? Like when do I need to reach out for emergencies and that type of stuff. So it kind of takes off the easy questions right out of the gate, so we're not inundating our coordinators or our co-coordinators or our hybrid model. It helps kind of filter out the easy questions, and so the ones that come in are the ones that really need specific answering, or like this is an actual emergency. So the Kitten Lady has really good materials that are free. You can find her website and her YouTube channel that has a ton of videos on there on how to care for like neonatal kittens and things like that. Like we had one at the shelter I worked at, we had one foster who was amazing with neonates. And in 2 years, she had only lost one kitten. Like she was so good that then we hit her up to do all the neonate kitten training. So she became essentially a coach, right? She wound up being the mentor for all of the other fosters. And she went through a lot of the stuff that she learned through trials and tribulations and things like that. And she became a resource. It was like, if you have kitten problems, a lot of times we would hit her up and be like, hey, we're getting this question, like, what would you do? Because she truly was an expert in that specific field. So there are kind of like the communication is critical on how we're communicating, because this is where like they're not in our like I say shelter, but it could just be like not in a central resource where you can see everything, right? So it's communicating to all of the fosters that are outside of our agency on like what's happening. There's a lot there. In Facebook is there's been some kind of concerns about data, and some people are not on it anymore. I don't know if your friends groups looks like mine, but there's a lot of people that have just bailed and aren't on Facebook anymore. So Slack is a really good, it's an instant messaging service. They do have a nonprofit pricing, which makes it affordable slash free, depending on the size of your organization. It was free for us, for the small group that we were. And it is amazing because you can actually invite people outside of your organization to a specific channel, and everything is 100% secure. So we can have foster conversations within that, and then they can communicate with each other so they feel like they're part of a community. Discord is another one that I've seen agencies use, that it was originally like for video gamers to chat and do stuff, but they've opened it up to anybody, and anybody can have a channel. You have an invitation code, but anybody that has that invitation code can join. That's the only thing. It's not like super secure, but it would be one where you would have to be invited to be able to join it. And there you can also break it out. It's a lot like Slack, where there's different channels and things like that, that we can have discussions and things like that, where conversations can happen with that group of fosters, and they can share their experience on those kind of platforms. The foster coaches, this is key, right? The ones that are seasoned and experienced have a tremendous amount of knowledge. So the foster coaches, they can take a lot of pressure off the coordinator. So if we're not using like the Maddie's pet assistant, the foster coaches can be that point of contact to filter out some of those basic questions, so that if the coach can't answer the question, then they can take it to the coordinator. So it kind of becomes a screen or a filter, so that we're not inundating the coordinators with just a ton of questions, because that's one that just kind of bogs down that whole system. And we get into the retention component of fosters. So generally what we think of is, when we talk about like retention, is we think about like, oh, they go and we get them an animal, they foster, and then we have to retain them. But the process actually starts the minute that they show interest, right? So once we start like recruiting, that's when the retention starts. So we have to do everything that we can to keep them interested. And we talked about some basic stuff of like, if we can put healthy, easily adoptable animals into the homes and they can get adopted out quickly, they can get the bug of seeing that they are directly impacting the organization by moving animals through very, very quickly. And then over time, then we can be like, oh, we can offer the training. And if they want to dip their toe into it, we can start with like the foster to adopt programs, or we can just start with like a sleepover, just dip your toe into the thing. And then we slowly build them up, and then over time we're able to train them to take on more and more kind of difficult cases. So it would be like, oh, we have a litter of perfectly adoptable kittens, we can put that into a foster home to get adopted out, and then move them gradually to a little bit younger, to like 6 to 8 week old, which they're weaned, they're eating gruel, that type of stuff. And there's just like, oh, that's not too bad. And then we can actually start working on like bottle babies and that type of stuff, and start leaning them towards that direction. But we just don't throw bottle babies right at them, because we know the failure to thrive rate is really high, and that's a great way of not retaining any fosters whatsoever. So the retention support, obviously practical support, those are policies, procedures. There's three levels: is practical, physical, and emotional. The physical support is the actual like stuff that we give them: the litter boxes, heating pads, food, that type of stuff. The emotion support, this is the big one. This is one that after foster losses, right? If we have a litter of puppies and they get parvo and they all don't survive and they were in a foster home, that is really detrimental to that particular foster. So having a process like sending flowers, or honoring those fosters with like a wind chime, or doing sympathy cards, things like that, like listening to them, be there, is that resource, is going to go a long way. So they may need some time in between fostering. They may not want to foster again, and that's perfectly okay. But if we show compassion and we work them through that process of losing a foster because it is traumatic. And they, even if they don't foster for us, they're more likely going to want to support us, and they may turn into a donor at that point. And so they'll support with donation, but they don't feel comfortable fostering anymore. And that's okay. As long as they're engaged with the organization, it's still a win. So the retention plan, a lot of times, we're having regular check-ins, right, is going to be key. Like finding out what's working, not what's not working. Like what are things that we need to change immediately? Having that regular conversation with our fosters is really key to a good, successful retention plan. We have to have conversations with them. We have to find out what's going on with them, and we have to take time out of our day to listen to them because they are an extension of the organization that we are all in, and that we need to engage them in as many processes as we can. So survey, follow-up interviews, getting their thoughts, listening to them, setting up aside time to coach and train. Like what's the next level, like what's the next tier that they get to? Let's start with the easy animals and let's move to a little bit more and more difficult animals. And what's that training process look like? Are they interested in doing that kind of stuff? Or is like let's keep kind of engaging them, because otherwise they may just get bored and be like, oh, you know what, I did it for a while, I can check that box off my list and be like, yeah, I was a foster for once. And let's we want to retain them for as long as we possibly can. And we understand that life events happen, things change, you know, and they're unable to do it, and that's fine too. But we want to coach them through that entire process of getting them to the next level. So the training also builds confidence, right? So anytime that they get more knowledge, then they feel more comfortable in supporting whatever group that we need them to support. It's really easy to rely on the same fosters over and over and over and over again, but that's a good recipe for them to get burnout, right? And that's what we want to avoid. So we want them to feel important, and they're an integral part of the mission and success of the organization. So having things like newsletters with success stories and testimonials and things like that, sending out regular thank you cards and doing spotlights on social media for our fosters makes them feel like they actually part of the community and part of the team of the organization. I think that's one of the complaints that I hear when I go to shelters and we do like reviews and things like that. One of the things that I do is I make it a point to talk to volunteers and fosters, and in that is one of the biggest complaints that I get is they don't ever feel like they're seen. They don't feel like they're ever heard. They don't feel like they're part of the team. So we need to go out of our way to make them feel special and like they're actually having a huge impact on the organization, because they actually are. And one of there's different perks that we can do. We can waive adoption fees if they actually want to keep their adoption or their foster, and then do foster failure. We have part we can have it so that they actually have kind of a say, and we get so much information from the fosters that we can actually find a really good fit for the home. So they can also get discount tickets or free tickets to organizational events. We can we always did a massive party at the end of kitten season and just kind of had a blowout with all of our kitten fosters, and just being like, we made it through another season, guys. And then we would do drawings and prizes and that sort of stuff, and we would just make them feel like they're really appreciated. So here's the conclusion: is use your data to find out what groups are the most at need, either need of from sickness or euthanasia. Develop the plan based on the resources that we have available and grow that over time. And then create the recruitment plan based on the demographic data that we have, set up the regular training for the different fosters. And then retention is all about the ease of how easy it is to foster, essentially. Like we need to remove all those barriers to make it just so easy for them and make it feel like they're part of the team, and not throw up all these artificial barriers so that they don't feel like they're appreciated, essentially. If you do that, it's a good start of a kind of building out a good quality foster program that's actually going to stand the test of time. And with that, there's my contact information if you guys want to email me. If you guys have any questions about, well, pretty much anything, that is where I am. And then we can start taking any questions. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see the chat as well.
Awesome, Tim. Thank you for the great information. Let's see. I did want to ask a question. So you say to start small, correct, and build up from there. What about when we have some of these smaller shelters and rescues that want to use fosters, but they run into not having enough resources to give them, or it's a concern that maybe they can't supply all of the supplies that a foster would need for the time frame of housing the animal?
Yeah, that comes with kind of building out the plan, right? So before we leap in and start putting animals in homes, we need to make sure that we're prepared for it. So that's part of that, like, okay, well, we find that, and that's part of the goals, right? So if we're talking, say, let's use neonates as an example, because kitten season's coming up. We know we're going to get inundated with kitten season. We're going to get slammed with all these neonates. One, hopefully we're doing our education of we're not kidnapping kittens, and let's make sure that they actually are orphaned and we're not orphaning them on our own. Like that's key number one. But okay, let's say that we do have orphan kittens that are coming in. Now what do we do? Like there may be, I've seen shelters that have euthanasia size requirements, which again, there's like, given the size of the organization, like that could be the resource that they have. Like they don't have resources to deal with kittens, so that those are euthanasia candidates within that organization. And I'm not here to judge, like that is given the resources. Hopefully what we're going to do is like we want to reduce that. So we're going to say like, what is 10%? Like, can we have enough donations or raise enough funds to solve 10% this year? If we can do that and we're successful at it, that's where the growing comes in. Being like, okay, then we can go back out to the community and be like, hey, we were super successful given the donations that you did. This is what we were able to do with it. And then we can actually communicate, and transparency is key with everything, right? So if we're transparent in our communication and we're transparent on the success, then we can get more donations in the future. And we can also partner with, say, like a Tractor Supply or something like that. So if we need KMR or the bottles with the nipples, things like that, be like they can get that super cheap. We can go to the manager and being like, hey, would you be able to donate this, and or could you just sell it to us at cost, and then basically get a donor to fund that, right? So that's one thing that we can do, is reach out to some of those organizations. And then when we see the success, then we can tag them in those posts and give them free advertising. Thanks to Tractor Supply, we were able to get the supplies that we need in order to save this number of kittens, and then ultimately that will start to grow over time, and then they start to feel part of the community, blah, 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 all that stuff. So that is where we kind of start and be like, it's really easy to be like, we don't have enough stuff. Be like, okay, well, how do we get the stuff? Like you have to be open and transparent with your communication. If you're not, like, people don't know you need support unless you tell them you need support. And that comes with just being open and honest.
Okay, great. We had a question from Riley. She said, where can we find grants to help shelters and or rescues start, continue, grow their foster programs?
That's a good question. I do have, let's see. I'm going to drop something in the chat here. And luckily for you,
questions, just drop them in the chat.
luckily for you all that are on this call, you get the access to this, but I do have this one right here. So there is a group out there. It's charitypaws.com for those of you that are watching the recording. And they actually have a list of 50 organizations, like 50 plus grant organizations that will help animal welfare. So there's kind of restrictions on, some of them are for spay neuter, some of them are for, this one has just focus multiple areas of focus. Well, there you go. Like you can pretty much just, and then you can look at what their kind of grant cycles are, and then you can see like if there's one that's going to fit, and then you can definitely apply for a lot of that stuff. If I will say, like, if you're looking for like best friends, right now we have our goal of getting every shelter no kill by 2025. So all of our funding is going towards that. So if you are a rescue organization that wants to partner with an organization that is below a 90% save rate, the benchmark for no kill, and you can do that from our life-saving dashboard on bestfriends.org. You can find out in Kansas like which organizations are kind of below that benchmark, and then reach out to them and be like, I would like to help, like what, and that's where the data comes in. What population do you need the most help with? And then I can actually help fund that if that is going to help get those animals out of the shelter, which would then, of course, increase the save rate of that shelter because they wouldn't be euthanizing those animals, right? So that helps get them to the 90%. So that's something that Best Friends can help. But everything that we're funding right now for the next 2 years is straight up. It has to be like moving the needle to get all of these shelters to 90%.
Okay, great. And just like you said, for anybody who's watching the replay of this, he put it in the chat and it's charitypaws.com/grants, animal shelters, rescues. So you guys can look up charitypaws.com for any of that assistance. Is there any other questions that anybody has? I don't see anything in the chat in particular. Tim, I want to thank you again for your time and your expertise this afternoon. Our next webinar is going to be on March 20th at noon with you again. You guys can look out for an email early part of March with that webinar information. We will have the slide deck put up here hopefully in the next week or two, and we can send out a notification when that information's up. You guys have Tim's information. If you have any questions, please follow up with him. And everybody have a great afternoon. Happy Valentine's Day.
Yeah, enjoy the Chiefs parade.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, bye,
Have a
everybody.
good